to welcome you to this evening's Tales of Cape Cod presentation. William Bill Burke last spoke at Tales in 2019. He has been employed by the National Park Service for 33 and a half years, and for 21 of those years, he has been an historian, cultural resources manager, program manager. He manages the Cape Cod National Seashore's historical landscapes, museum objects, historic structures, and archaeological sites. Prior to his current assignment, he was a supervising park ranger and district interpreter at national parks in Lowell and Provincetown in Massachusetts and Morristown in New Jersey. Prior to that, he was a national park ranger in multiple locations in Wyoming, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, among other locations. He is currently an adjunct professor at the Open University of Wellesley, leading small classes on the exploration of Cape Cod history and culture. He is a head coach of the Monomoy girls tennis team, Cape and Island League champs in 2017. He has a BA in history from Providence College, where he graduated summa cum laude, and a master's degree from the College of William and Mary, where he apprenticed in historic archaeology for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Tonight, Bill will talk about a small band of English religious dissenters and a small crew from the Mayflower that set ashore in Provincetown 4 centuries ago. Their landing set in motion a brief but intense 5 weeks of exploration, rummaging, and soul-searching on the outer Cape prior to settling in Plymouth. What were they looking for? What were their intentions? Interactions with the native people already here, and what is the legacy of their encounter? This program is sponsored by Lloyd and Linda George. Are you here tonight? And Doug Mitchell and Christine Welch. As a reminder, on September 20th, next Monday, we will present Linda Monchik, who will perform her acclaimed one-act play, Rose, about the Kennedy family matriarch, Rose Kennedy. Following tonight's presentation, please join us for refreshments. And so let us now welcome Bill Burke.
So we'll do a little tennis coaching first. See everyone's forehand, right? All right. Well, thank you, Tales of Cape Cod, for inviting me. I think this organization is awesome. You get to talk, you get speakers in here to talk about all kinds of history, and it's right here in your own backyard. That is great. So the title of the program is Now You See Them, Now You Don't. So one would think that talking about 5 weeks of history in 1620 would be easy. And it is kind of easy, I think. However, I'm conflicted because it's very complex, the bigger story of Europeans coming to America. So, I was always trained in the National Park Service. You do 3 things in a program. You tell people what you're going to do, then you do what you said you were going to do, and then you tell them what you did. So I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to be talking a little bit without any slides, just about some thoughts about this subject. Because as anyone knows me, they know I'm pretty philosophical. I think about these things a lot. And then we'll get into the actual events of 1620, and with the focus on the pilgrims who were here on Cape Cod for 5 weeks. And we'll be using a lot of the quotes out of Mort's Relation, which is the one of only 2 first-hand written accounts of the events of 1620 on Cape Cod. And we'll go through some slides, but I only have 20 slides, a lot of quotes. hopefully get any comments or questions that you might have. And then a little bit, the last part will be the legacy, the aftermath of the 5 weeks on Cape Cod, and give you my thoughts about what it all means. The Pilgrims are endlessly fascinating people. I almost get emotional thinking about their stick-to-itiveness, their courageousness, their durability, people who had real faith, and people who were willing to do anything for their faith. I'm involved with the Pilgrims simply because during the 5-week stay of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod, they trampled on the future lands of Cape Cod National Seashore. So oftentimes I'm asked to talk about the events, not in the big picture, but just places like Pilgrim Spring. People want to know Pilgrim Spring in Truro and why there's a sign there and what happened there. Places like Corn Hill, again, big sign on Route 6, Corn Hill. Well, there's a good reason why it's called Corn Hill. And then I've had many scholars over the years ask me, I want to hike exactly where the Pilgrims hiked for those 5 weeks. Do you have a good map? And believe it or not, historians have used Mort's relation particularly, and they've tried to make maps following the footsteps. So, but we don't have a good map, but we'll try to walk you through it. So I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm kind of a Pilgrim fan. I don't come here as a native person with ancestors that go back thousands of years. I come here as a Massachusetts native, Irish, Polish, Italian. And kind of the way I grew up, Pilgrims were like up here on a pedestal. However, it takes a good spouse to let you know when you're too high on a pedestal and you're wrong. So my wife, Stacia, 33 years ago when we got married, I managed to pry her out of New Jersey and away from her family, thank God. And I was excited because I had just gotten a job at Cape Cod National Seashore. We lived in Truro for the first couple of years, which is beautiful, dark and lonely. And one of the first side trips we did was to Plymouth Rock. And Stacia had never been to Plymouth Rock. And I was in my naive stage about the Pilgrims. So we planned the whole trip around going to Plymouth, and I brought her to the Rock. How many of you have been to Plymouth Rock? And so I showed her, and anyone who knows me knows I love to build things up, before you actually see something. And she took a look at it and said, okay, any good shops around here? So that was the first notch I was knocked down about the Pilgrims. But in all seriousness, there's 3 things about the Pilgrims and the Pilgrim story that make this a tricky story. And I apologize if you don't think I should be mixing humor in this story, but I find that's a good way to get started. 3 things that make the Pilgrims tricky and hard to kind of get a conclusion about. The first thing is their complexity and the time in which they lived, the English Reformation. This was a time, this is in the 1500s primarily, into the 1600s. This is a time of religious persecution in England. If you remember Henry VIII, he breaks from the Catholic Church, and the Church of England becomes the official church in England. And he begins to hound and hunt down people who did not adhere to the Church of England. And the Reformation in itself, and I had a lot of classes on the Reformation in college, and I had way too many classes on the Reformation, but it was a profound change in Western civilization in Europe. And the Catholic Church was no longer going to hold sway over all these countries. So the whole topic of the Reformation and people being persecuted and imprisoned and executed over religious beliefs is so far removed from us today, at least for some of us maybe, that it's just hard to make sense out of why a group would stand up for their faith and risk it all. And there are groups in this, unfortunate groups in this world that have to do this still every day, but it's becoming more foreign to the younger generation as our country enjoys an awful lot of prosperity and freedom from war internally. So it's a tough topic. The Pilgrims were separatists, and they were in an extreme minority. So if, say we have 100 people here, roughly, and I'm going to ask you to stand up in just a second. If this whole audience represented the entire population of England in 1620, there would be one person in the audience, on average, that was a Puritan, right here. You're brave, good. Puritans were working within the Church of England to try to reform the church. So I'm Catholic, I'll come right out and say it. So it's hard to bash Catholics, but at the time, the Reformation was essentially other countries and other peoples rejecting the Pope, rejecting the Catholic Church, and saying that the church had strayed from the pure study of the Bible and how to get to heaven. And so these countries, much of Germany, England, adopted these reformed religions. They didn't want stained glass anymore. They didn't want a lot of singing. They didn't want priestly vestments. They didn't want a central church authority assigning bishops from some central place. They wanted to be left alone. They wanted to study the Bible. They wanted to pray inwardly, and they wanted to assign religious elders and deacons very locally within their own little congregations. And that's what they wanted. So one out of a group of this size would be a Puritan trying to purify this new Church of England, because if they didn't go far enough, there's still too much of this Catholic stuff in and around the church. So you would be brave. You were in a very small minority. However, the Pilgrims were super radical compared to this woman. They didn't want to work within the Church of England and negotiate with the king and the bishops to try to fix things. They wanted to break free. They didn't want to attend Church of England services. They were going cold turkey. So, if this room held 1,000 people, and you were all gathered as Puritans, so all your friends showed up, 1,000 people. So the Puritans want to work within the church, but they want to reform it. But every so often there's a separatist. Guess how many of a room of 1,000 Puritans would be a separatist in terms of the numbers? There would again be one, so you can stand up. Thank you. Is everyone getting the math with that? So the separatists were willing to risk life, limb, property, family, harmony, everything to get out of England. Well, at first they tried to just be able to worship secretly. And they did so with some mixed success. They would, for hundreds of years, these separatists were hounded. Why weren't you at church? Why didn't you have your child baptized in the Church of England? Why? So they persevered for a number of years. But then in 1607, these separatists, who were kind of based out of the center of England, near the Scrooby, a village called Scrooby, England, they decided they were going to leave the country. And the king at the time, James, would not let them. So under dark of night and paying off boat captains at great cost, a small group of separatists boarded a ship and headed to Holland, where there was religious freedom. And as soon as those separatists got on that boat, all of the king's soldiers came out of the woods. The captain had betrayed them, and all those separatists who tried to make a run for Holland were arrested. Most were eventually released, but you can tell by all the accounts that you can read, they were being squeezed out of their life, their liberty, their property, and religious freedom. So again in 1608, they get out of jail, and they finally get over to a small group of about 100 gets over to Holland, and they set up a community in Leiden. So from 1608 until 1620, the events we're talking about here, for about 12 years, the separatist grows to a couple of hundred, and they stay in Holland, and they have religious freedom. However, being the stubborn type, they were being assimilated by the Dutch culture. And even though they had religious freedom, they were suffering economically because they were not allowed, because they were not Dutch citizens, they were not allowed to join some of the trade guilds and other craft guilds. And so they were suffering economically. And I think what really got under their skin was as they were having children, their children were learning Dutch and learning the much more liberal society that Holland and the Dutch colonies were. So, to make a long story short, the Reformation, the separatist movement, the events of trying to get out of Holland make this group extremely fascinating to study, but a little tricky to really fully understand. The second thing that makes this a tricky little topic is what I call the 100-piece puzzle principle. So I always try to tell, when I do kids programs about history, and we all had history in school, history was boring for most of us. It was dates, it was remembering, oh my God, was it this person, that person? So what I try to just say to any event, whether it was 9/11, the Civil War, how many pieces to the puzzle do we have sitting here in 2021 to that event or that event? Pieces of the puzzle would be photographs of the event. So let's say we're going to talk about your last birthday party. I know you all have big birthday parties when it's your birthday. It's a time for celebration. So think about your last birthday, and what exists from that last birthday? People's memories who went to your party, your own memories that you were at your party, hopefully you remember. There were pictures. Was there a cake? Did you blow out the candles? Was there a big party afterwards? And I'm willing to bet if that 100-piece puzzle in theory, exists, you could probably find 98 pieces of the 100 pieces that would tell the story of that birthday. I would hope, unless you were drinking heavily or something, you would probably be able to come up with 90 to 98 pieces to tell the story of your last birthday. What about the events of 9/11? Yes, there's photographs, lots of books written sources, there's eyewitness accounts, there's the where I was on 9/11. So how many pieces out of a 100-piece puzzle exist to explain to someone what 9/11 is? I'd be willing to bet 90. What about 400 years ago, when the Pilgrims are here on Cape Cod for 5 weeks? How many pieces in a 100-piece puzzle do we have to explain in detail, with 100% accuracy, what happened during those 5 weeks? Does that 100-piece puzzle have 50 pieces? Are there photographs from 1620? Are there paintings from 1620? So there's some Dutch paintings of domestic life, so we kind of know the dress. Are there any paintings of pilgrims? There's only, I believe, only one painting of a pilgrim that was painted while that pilgrim was still alive, Edward Winslow. Are there written accounts of the 5 weeks on Cape Cod? Like I said at the beginning, there's 2. William Bradford writes a book that chronicles the entire history of Plymouth Colony, and he begins writing that 10 years after the events of these events, and that's a big, thick book. And then there's the Little Mort's Relation, which was an eyewitness account written by William Bradford and Edward Winslow. So there's written documentation. There's obviously no one alive. There's no eyewitness accounts living today. And do you think under the extreme duress and emergency situations that these pilgrims were in, whether they really managed to write down much about it? No. So just a show of hands, how many of you think that in the 1620 story of the pilgrims roaming around Cape Cod, how many pieces are left to that puzzle to have a clear picture of what happened? How many would say over 50 pieces? Okay. I get into some great debates at the park because was the arm of the Cape physically that much different in 1620 than it is today? Physically? Were there beaches? Yeah. Were there forests? Yeah. The Cape's arm was wider because it wasn't eroded as much. Was the type of trees about the same as it is today? Yes and no. Okay, so anyway, how many people think it's less than 30 pieces left to the puzzle? How many people think it's less than 10 pieces left to the puzzle to create the picture? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just throwing it out there. How many people think there's less than 5 pieces of the puzzle from 1620 to go on for me to talk about? Less than 5 pieces. Just food for thought. So that makes it tricky. 400 years ago, if you think you can't remember yesterday too well, what'd you have for lunch yesterday? Right? The last thing that makes the Pilgrim story a little mind-boggling is trying to think like someone living in the 17th century. I can't do it. Life was so different. The vast majority of the population could not read and write. The vast majority of the population were God-fearing. The vast majority of the population were agriculture-based. And the vast majority of the population was somewhat impoverished, with some exceptions. But what did they think about God? What did they think about the land, ecology, preservation? What did they think about peoples who lived in other lands that they had heard about? So this point, I think, makes it the most difficult to do a talk on pilgrims, is they thought so much differently because they lived in such dramatically different times. So we could all just throw our hands up and say, well, Bill, you know, I can't really do this program, but we'll give it a shot. All right. So let's talk about some of the events, and we'll get into some of the juicy details, and then we'll talk about the aftermath and the legacy. All right. Let's see. I was reluctant to bring any slides because I find that in my career, we did slides. Remember the slides? And there was a point in my career where I was in charge of a 18 projector slideshow that was all synchronized with the other 17 projectors, with all these dissolve units. And I think something, this was back in the 90s, and I think something snapped in me. And I said, maybe the audiovisual isn't worth, you know, the effort. But we're down to PowerPoint and one nice little thing here. Oh, that's funny. All right. Yeah. Okay, so pilgrims. The term pilgrims is used by William Bradford. The term pilgrimage is to make a trip out of faith, out of yearning for something greater, to find something greater, to find something better. These are William Bradford's words. Religion hath been disgraced, the godly grieved, afflicted, persecuted, and many exiled. Sundry have lost their lives in prisons and other ways. The place they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, but devoid of any civil inhabitants. A little window in that last two words. He's referencing the New World, North America, and saying it's devoid of all civil inhabitants. We're getting a little bit into the mind of the 17th century Englishman. There was a deep-seated fear. It was a mixed bag. Deep-seated fear of the New World and the people who lived here, the native people, because of the stories they've heard from sailors, other explorers, but the fantastical opportunities to come to North America for the natural resources and the riches that they could gain. And in the case of these people, getting the heck away from England and all the problems. So the Pilgrim story has been romanticized over the years. Here's the pilgrims to the left that are staying in Holland, and the pilgrims to the right that are leaving Holland. They're going to board the Speedwell, which is a small ship that they purchased, and they're going to come to the New World. And then they come over from Holland on the Speedwell, which turns out to be a very leaky ship, and they get to the Mayflower. They meet up with some more of the separatists who are secretly living in England. Just a point of clarification, so not all the separatists who were living in Holland left Holland in 1620. Actually, a good majority stayed with the thinking they'd go on a later ship once things were set up. And then there was going to be a rendezvous with the much larger Mayflower. And all this had to be on the up and up, by the way. So the separatists were kind of risking things because they actually had an agreement with the king that they were going to go to the Virginia colony. They had an agreement with several English financiers who set them up with these ships and started taking the Pilgrims' money to do so, provisioning the ships. So they left Holland, had a charter to go to the Virginia colony, which ran from present-day Virginia to Manhattan. And then they met in England, picked up more passengers, crew, and the plan was in June 1620 they would leave England with the Mayflower and the Speedwell and go to somewhere in the, they were shooting for Manhattan, present-day Manhattan. Little did they know, they knew very little about Cape Cod. Several of the people, some of the ship's crew had been to New England, had seen Cape Cod, been on Cape Cod, but for the 102 passengers, they had not been to Cape Cod. And we know that for, give or take, 10,000 years, Native Americans had been living on Cape Cod and the rest of New England. And so they were coming into a culture that was well established. So they didn't get to Manhattan. So they saw Cape Cod in November after 66 days on the Mayflower. The Speedwell, by the way, after 200 miles with both Mayflower and Speedwell coming from England, after 200 miles, the Speedwell develops leaks. Both ships go back to England. So all these delays are being caused, and they really don't get off in earnest to the New World until September. Those 2 months are going to really kill them because they get here in November instead of September. So the plan was to get here this time of year. Anyway, they hit Cape Cod almost, and they try to go around the southern part of the arm of the Cape to then go down to the New York Hudson River Valley area. They hit some of those Pollock Rips and those other dangerous places off of the Chatham coast. They turn the Mayflower around, they come up and they get into Provincetown Harbor, which a few of the people on the crew knew about. Great deep water port, the best one on Cape Cod. And this is where the descriptions in Mort's relation, they get into the first laundry day, which historians have pieced together as being on a Monday. And that's an old New England tradition to do laundry on a Monday. I don't follow that, but. And then, so what are the Pilgrims looking for? They just want to set up a place to live that can sustain people with water and food and enough wood to build shelters and a nice harbor so that future ships coming in can get here. So here they are, Provincetown Harbor, sitting on the Mayflower, November, and they want fresh water, food, clearable, tillable land, defensible position, good harbor, deep water. So if you're familiar with Provincetown and you're sitting in Provincetown Harbor, there's not a lot of fresh water in Provincetown, even today. They have to pipe it in from Truro. So they didn't find a lot of fresh water in the immediate area. There's a few shallow ponds. So one of the first things they make a big deal about in Mort's relation is finding this water at Pilgrim, what we call Pilgrim Spring. And so this is what, I'll give you the full version. So it's a small exploration party that comes off of the Mayflower. They march through boughs and bushes under hills and valleys, which tore our very armor in pieces. And yet we could meet with none of them, they're talking about the natives who they'd seen in the distance, nor their houses, nor find any fresh water, which we were greatly which we greatly desired and stood in need of, for we had brought neither beer nor water with us, and our victuals was only biscuit and Holland cheese and a little bottle of aquavitae. So we were sore athirst. About 10 o'clock we came into a deep valley full of brush, wood gale, and long grass, through which we found little paths or tracks, and there we saw deer and found springs of fresh water, of which we were heartily glad, and sat us down and drunk our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drink in all of our lives. It was a big deal for them. So this is the area of Pilgrim Spring today, out in Truro. At that time, it would have been more hardwood forest. That's what the pollen analysis tells us from the ponds. And the views from the area, this is what it looks like, the area looks like today. This is near Head of the Meadow in Truro. And there's a little marker there. So for those of you who want to follow in the footsteps, we kind of think this is the place. There's a little burbling spring there, which in the summer really doesn't flow at all. And it's kind of like my wife seeing Pilgrim Rock, but even worse. People are bringing bottles down to, this isn't New Hampshire. So it's a bit of a disappointment. But there were a strong fervor in New England to find these pilgrim sites. And we don't have time, but there was a fellow in Truro who absolutely thought he found the right site, donated a whole bunch of land to the state of Massachusetts. It became Pilgrim Springs State Park, and then those lands were given to the National Seashore in 1961. So there's actually 3 explorations that leave the Mayflower. The first one finds the fresh water. But then the second exploration, they're going down further into Truro, and they're looking for a good place to start a settlement. But they start getting themselves into trouble. So from the second expedition, we had marched 5 or 6 miles into the woods and could find no signs of any people. We returned again another way, and as we came into the plain ground, we found a place like a grave, but it was much bigger and longer than any we had ever seen. It was also covered with boards. So as we mused what it should be and resolved to dig it up, we found first a mat, and under that a fair bow, and there another mat, and under that a board about 3/4 long, finely carved and painted. Also between the mats we found bowls, trays, dishes, and little trinkets. We opened underneath one of the mats and found in great quantity a fine and perfect red powder. That's ochre, which was used in native burials. And in it the bones and skull of a man. The skull had fine yellow hair still on it, and some of the flesh unconsumed. There was bound up with it a knife, a pack needle, and 2 or 3 old iron things. It was bound up in a sailor's canvas cassock and a pair of cloth breeches. The red powder was a kind of embalmment and yielded a strong but not offensive smell. It was fine as any flower. The level of detail with some of this is fantastic. So in today's interpretations of the pilgrims, as we become more culturally sensitive, you could call the pilgrims grave robbers. I guess they were. I'm not going to make excuses for them. But they were desperate, they were hungry, they were looking for a settlement site, and they stopped and they got involved. And what did Bradford call them at the beginning in his description? He didn't think much of the native peoples. And we'll talk about corn. Okay, there we found where a house had been and 4 or 5 old planks laid together. Also, we found a great kettle, which had been some ship's kettle and brought out of Europe. There was also a heap of sand, and in it, underneath the sand, we found a little old basket full of fair Indian corn, and digged further and found a fine, great new basket full of very fair corn of this year, with some 36 goodly ears of corn, some yellow, some red, others mixed with blue, which was a very goodly sight. The basket was round and narrow at the top. It held about 3 or 4 bushels, which was as much as 2 of us could lift up from the ground, and was very handsomely and cunningly made. So again, here we go. The Pilgrims are digging up the seed corn for the native peoples who would be using that to plant probably the next season's corn. It'd probably been harvested in the summer and early fall, and there it was in the ground, buried. And when you read between the lines and some of the other lines in Mort's relation, there is a clear intention, at least in the account, that they were going to pay back the natives, which they mention in the account. And in fact, after they settle Plymouth, the following year, they do pay back the Indians living on Cape Cod. But again, this is stealing. So again, the legacy, you keep getting yanked back and forth. You admire them, you despise them, you criticize them, you understand them. Perhaps some of you already have your mind made up and it's pretty clear cut. I'm conflicted. And then kind of the final straw for the Pilgrims is they send out the last expedition. And again, it's getting into early December now. The people, the passengers in the Mayflower, the women, the children, the crew, they're just hanging around in the harbor, miserable. And these small expeditionary parties that the Pilgrims are sending out are going and desperately looking for a place to settle. They rejected Provincetown. They rejected Pamet Harbor and Truro. They rejected Wellfleet Harbor based on where we know they went. So now they're coming down to Eastham. This is First Encounter Beach. Yeah, there's the graves. We talked about that. Here's some of the houses that they would have looked much like these Weetus, which can be found Plymouth Plantation and other places. The first encounter. One of our company, being abroad, came running in and cried, "They are men, Indians, Indians," and withal their arrows came flying amongst us. There's a really long, involved account in here of what happened, but essentially, on this last expeditionary party, the Pilgrims are camped on the beach in Eastham, somewhere around where First Encounter Beach is. And there was a battle between natives and the Pilgrims. Arrows were flying, muskets were being fired. Mort's relation doesn't mention any casualties on either side. And the Native Americans run, the Pilgrims hold their ground, and today there was a very interesting process for this 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims in talking about the wording of plaques and commemorative markers. So here is the revised version of the First Encounter marker. Near this site, the Naussib tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, seeking to protect themselves and their culture, had their first encounter December 8th, 1620, with Miles Standish, John Carver, William Bradford, and Edward Winslow, etc., etc. And again, First Encounter Beach today. I was part of a very interesting commemoration at First Encounter Beach in which the native peoples gathered on the beach along with some reenactors from Plymouth Plantation. And it was a very interesting event in which that event was commemorated, the first encounter. So after that encounter, Edward Winslow writes, "So after we had given God thanks for our deliverance, we took our shallop and went on our journey and called this place the First Encounter." That little shallop then takes the key members of the Pilgrim Party down, not far from where we are, on the inside of the arm of the Cape, up to Plymouth, which was familiar with some of the navigators aboard the shallop who had been to Plymouth earlier, which was a Native American village called Patuxet. And then that decision was made to settle in Plymouth. A couple of reasons why they did settle in Plymouth. One was there was acres and acres of cleared fields that had been used for agriculture for a long time. It was a Native American village, and it had been a successful village. Unfortunately, in 1617, a plague decimated approximately 90% of the native peoples living in that Patuxet settlement. So the Pilgrims walk in literally to a ghost town, fresh running water, cleared fields, defensible hills behind it, and that's where they settle. They go back with the shallop to Mayflower. Everyone starts that whole story of the settlement of Plymouth. All right. The aftermath and the legacy. Well, there's a couple tangible things left from these events, not a lot. One is at the Cove Burial Ground in Eastham, which is a tremendous, it's right on Route 6 in Eastham. It has four Mayflower passengers buried in that cemetery. Because after the Pilgrims settled in 1620, the Plymouth area, they became restless after a couple of decades, and a number of the prominent families in Plymouth chose to go to Eastham. I'll name you the 7 families. Maybe you're related. The 7 families that came from Plymouth to settle Eastham: Bangs, Cook, Doane, Higgins, Prince, Smalley, and Snow. And there are monuments to, 3 Mayflower passengers who lived and died in Eastham: Constance Hopkins Snow, Joseph Rogers, and Giles Hopkins. So it's an interesting aftermath, is that the Plymouth colony is quickly eclipsed by the colony to the north in Boston. Even though the Pilgrims had 10-year head start and settled Plymouth, their numbers by 1630 were less than 1,000 settlers. The Pilgrims, unfortunately for them, were largely an impoverished group, had very little backing, and they had been duped so many times by the English investors that by the time they get to Plymouth, it literally takes them 30 years to pay off their loans to London financiers. But to the north, remember we talked about the Puritans. It's the Puritans, who are a much greater number, who are much better off financially, and are much more educated. I believe it's 70% of the Puritans could read and write. So that much larger group of Puritans start settling the Boston area, the city on the hill. And in that 10 years, from 1630 to 1640, they're numbering close to 40,000. And the Pilgrims are still in the single thousand digits. And by 1690, the Plymouth colony is absorbed by the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, or the province of Massachusetts Bay. So the Pilgrims kind of become somewhat of a footnote in terms of prosperity and numbers. But the one thing that lingers on Cape Cod is not only the Cove Burial Ground, but the Pilgrim Monument. And any of you who either grew up in Provincetown or have friends in Provincetown, they still are very proud of the fact that the Mayflower spent 5 weeks and sheltered those pilgrims so they could survive and then move on. So the legacy of the Pilgrims locally is a debate about the Pilgrims and how they affected the Native Americans. There's the debate about why the Pilgrims came back to Eastham. They settled Wellfleet and Truro to some extent as well. But their larger legacy is still debated today. And to give you an example, we hosted a series of events at the National Seashore for the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims, and the Eastham 400th Committee commissioned a historical scholar, Ian Saxene, teaches at Bridgewater State University, and he produced the story of the first encounter at Nauset. And it is an eye-opening interpretation, very well documented, on what is the legacy of the first encounter. Was it a signal that the relationship between the Pilgrims and the natives would always be hostile? And how much responsibility do the Pilgrims have for pushing out the Native Americans who lived on and the rest of southeastern Massachusetts? But that's for another day and another time. We've gone through the 5 weeks. This is the part I tell you what I was going to do. We went on our journey. We talked about the 3 things that make it tricky to study the Pilgrims. We talked about the 100-piece puzzle principle, how there's not a lot of pieces to the puzzle left. We talked about the complexity of the Reformations and the small number of separatists that there were. And thank you for standing up and doing that. And we talked about the mixed legacy in the 17th century mind and not really understanding that. At this time, I would love to hear any thoughts, comments that you'd like to make on this topic. Yes, in the back.
Question. Did the Pilgrims look at Barnstable Harbor as a possible site for the settlement?
Not very closely. No, they had a pretty decent chart. Oops. They had a pretty decent chart. Of Cape Cod. It was a John Smith chart. But no, they did not. So they went by Barnstable Harbor. I don't think they slowed down. Sorry.
Can I just make one little statement on that?
Yeah.
In Ford's relation, they said that when they sailed by Barnstable Harbor, they had a snow squall and they never saw it. But if you read what the people wrote in the 1850s, the first that brought Ford's relation out, they said it was such a fine place that had they gone in, they probably would have stayed. But fortunately, they didn't.
Wow. Okay. The old snowstorm kind of threw them off. Forgot about that. Oh, yeah. Well, so the Mayflower had 102 passengers and between 30 and 40 crew. Of the 102, not everyone was a pilgrim. About half of them were really the religious separatists. Others were going along for the opportunity to get to the New World for other reasons. So, right. Other questions, comments? Yes?
The Fort Hill story, that was earlier, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Pilgrims didn't go near Fort Hill. They pretty much stayed on the bay side and not on the Fort Hill side. The term Fort Hill comes a little bit later when the Pilgrims, some of the Pilgrims leave Plymouth, and they settled the Eastham area, the Nauset area. And there was a war going on a little bit after 1644 when they went to Eastham between the Dutch and the English. And all English towns, there was a ruling that said that every English town had to develop a fortified hill defense with at least one piece of artillery. So there's a lot of other Fort Hills in southeastern Massachusetts apparently. And this Fort Hill, if you've been to Fort Hill, there is a knob, overlooks Nauset Harbor. So Fort Hill is unrelated to the Pilgrims until they start to settle Eastham, and then they develop that fort. Because you know, those English and those Dutch never got along. There's another question.
Just about to ask about the relationship of the Pilgrims with the Dutch and they, you touched on some areas of controversy, but was there something in their religious separatism which made them unusually antagonistic in trying to adapt to living in late?
I can't speak to that very much. I'll just go on my context clues in that the Pilgrims were not really a very yielding type. So a lot of things rubbed them the wrong way and they had a hard time looking the other way and being assimilated. So I don't know of the specifics to answer your question, but I can only guess, knowing a little bit about European history and Dutch society over the years. Yeah, I think if you just look at Dutch paintings from that time period, there's just a frivolity and a type of lifestyle, perhaps, if you will, that didn't really suit them very well. So that would be the way I could kind of grope around answering that. If there was one country that a pilgrim probably didn't want to hang out in, that might be the country they shouldn't be hanging out in.
Do you know how many ships came after the first one?
Well, there was, in pretty quick succession over the next 2 years, there was the Anne, there was the Fortune, maybe one or two others. But they were extremely disappointing. The small numbers, so you can imagine the Pilgrims waiting for more people to join them because they had lost half their number the first winter. And so these ships would come here, very little supplies, very few people, able-bodied people, and all those subsequent ships in the first 2 years were extremely disappointing to them. Yeah. And there's an interesting subchapter to this. There's quite an exodus from New England because in England, if you remember Oliver Cromwell, he's going to overthrow the whole king system, and now the Pilgrims and everyone else wouldn't be persecuted. So there's actually a migration back to England once the English Civil War kind of frees up the status quo in England. So it's not a one-way migration, that's for sure. There's actually some historians think that a full third or more of the original people coming eventually go back. It's like the coast is clear. And who wants to hand-hewn their way out of the wilderness here? So. Yes, in the back?
Was William Bradford the one who coined the term Indians as far as Native Americans they encountered?
No, I forget which explorer coined that term. It wasn't Bradford. It was probably the Spanish.
So when he said Indians were coming, he was using
That was in that was in their lexicon, their language, but that's much earlier because the explorers thought they had made it to the East Indies and the Spice Land, and so the people living there were Indians. Yeah. Yes. Okay, we'll take two more questions and then yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask about how their relationship with the Indians evolved, specifically here on Cape Cod. We hear that after some period of time, the Indians take land. How did that evolve at the beginning up through the first year?
So the native people on Cape Cod, in their area of Eastham, the Nausetts in particular, they had not been touched by this plague, and they were almost at full strength. So that's a long, tough question to answer, but I would just say that it was a mixed bag. Part of the native population stayed and became Christianized with the preachers in Eastham. Other natives didn't want any part of that and moved away. And the whole land exchange, do you buy land from natives? That was a mess. That system was never established. And that was one thing the English settlers did not fairly trade for land with the native people because of their opinions of who these native peoples were. So, yeah, there was a lot of unfortunate pushing out of native peoples, and by the early part of the 1800s, there were very few Native Americans left in Wellfleet, Eastham, which is obviously regretful. But a portion were Christianized and learned the prayers and had the preacher with them. So it was kind of a mixed bag. All right, one more question on this side. Yeah.
Would you say some more detail about the travel of the shallop to Plymouth, the length of the time, the number of people?
Yeah, I should have had a slide that had the dates, but the first exploration was on foot only. The second exploration was a foot party and a shallop, kind of going parallel down to Truro. So they're coming down on the bay side in Truro with the shallop, and that was like a 3-day trip. And there was an overland party that met the shallop and came back. And then the third party was like that turned out to be a week because they went all the way to Wellfleet, first encounter in Eastham, and then all the way to Plymouth. So without getting into a lot of detail and a lot of time, there's three expeditions. Each expedition was several days.
So the last one was the better part of the week.
Yeah. By the time they get down to Wellfleet, explored their first encounter, and then by the time they got to Plymouth, they come riding in a storm. The shallop is breaking apart. They barely get in. The rudder's broken. And then they're there for a couple of days, fix the shallop, and by the time they all figure that out, it's about a week, I think. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us for some refreshments, and Bill may be able to answer some